I hate this seed oil nonsense that is going around. This idea that seed oils are going to give you cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease and all other sorts of health ailments, when the opposite is actually true. This is essentially a cover for proponents of very high saturated fat diets. And unfortunately, this is going to kill a lot of people in the future. Now, I don't dispute that some people have found that a carnivore type diet has helped them clear up otherwise unaddressable issues. This must be a wonderful thing, and I don't have a problem with people sharing that experience. But I do have a problem with people extrapolating that from a very small minority to then suggest that the diet is a good idea as a broader recommendation for everyone. Because as I said, that is going to kill a lot of people in the future. And why do I say that? Well, high saturated fat intake increases our risk of cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease, and these are two of the leading causes of death in the world. Now, high saturated fat intakes increase blood lipids, and high LDL and ApoB causally drive atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis, that's the buildup of plaque on artery walls. And so keeping saturated fat intake to roughly under 10% of your total calorie intake most of the time looks like it's going to really help minimize this CVD and CHD risk. Now, why am I recording this? I know I'm not going to convince anybody who's in this hardcore, high saturated fat, carnivore, anti-seed oil camp. I get it. But I do have a lot of people that follow my work and they want to know my opinion on this. You've got to beware of people demonizing seed oils and misrepresenting saturated fat and cholesterol fears as outdated or flawed science. They're essentially just shifting the blame as a distraction to justify their high animal diets. You'll typically hear from these people that the way that diet is driving heart disease risk has nothing to do with LDL cholesterol or ApoB, but it's due to inflammation. Now, inflammation is part of the process, but it doesn't appear to play a causal role. And unfortunately, what were once relatively fringe narratives used to justify consuming more bacon and butter, they've now become entrenched and seem to be making their way into public health policy and advice, inverting what is a consistent and congruent body of evidence due to what seem to be political influences. Now remember, contrarian and conspiratorial views can often point to a grain of truth within them, but narrative built upon grains of truth are often unsupported by evidence. And unfortunately, if people implement some of the proposed changes, such as eliminating seed oils from their diets and cooking with beef tallow, as is often suggested, it is not going to end well for a lot of people. So please, 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 please don't be one of them. Now, in terms of practical recommendations, what do we recommend here at RipBody? Well, I was updating the client guidelines that we give to clients as we onboard them just the other day. We say that there are two caveats to what we recommend around our calorie budget and then our protein minimum. The first is not to skew the carb or fat intake to either extreme. The reason that we mention carbs is because if anyone cuts back on their carb intake too much, then this can affect training performance. And if it affects training performance, then that's going to affect muscle growth when in a gaining phase or muscle retention when in a cutting phase. And then for fat intake, if you cut your fat intake too low, then your diet can get exceptionally bland and hard to sustain. Now, if the sweet spot for fat intake is generally 20 to 30% of total calories during maintenance and bulk phases and 15 to 25% during diet phases. Now, remember those numbers. So it's roughly 15 to 30% of total calorie intake. Now, the second caveat that we have here is to limit saturated fat intake for the reasons that we just said. Now, to reiterate, high saturated fat intakes increase your risk of cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease, which are two of the leading causes of death in the world. They do this by high saturated fat intakes increasing blood lipids and high LDL and ApoB causally driving atherosclerosis. That's a buildup of plaque on artery walls. And if you keep saturated fat intake to under 10% of your total calorie intake, most of the time, that's going to really help mitigate cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease risk. Now, for context, remember that we said here that somewhere between 15 to 25% of your total calorie intake should come from fat when dieting and 20 to 30 when bulking. So for context, researchers take 16 to 80% of total calorie intake coming from saturated fats as considered high, while 10% is considered low. And the greatest magnitude of risk reduction is observed when the baseline saturated fat intake is above 18% and the average saturated fat reduction is 8%. And if I recall correctly, it was something like 30% reduction. Now, this means that if you have a high baseline, a fairly small change to your diet can have a significant impact. For example, if you have a 2,500 calorie diet and you're in the habit of eating 25 grams of butter each day, for example, perhaps on toast or in the pan when cooking, if you swap that for margarine or obviously on your toast there, or an oil like a seed oil, vegetable oil, then that's going to help reduce your saturated fat intake by 9%. So if you swap butter, that's the saturated fat in your toast for margarine, and butter in the pan for vegetable oils, those are polyunsaturated fats. If you swap fatty cuts of meat for less fatty cuts of meat, and you just reduce junk foods that contribute a lot of saturated fat, pastries, etc., this is going to go a long way to reducing your cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease risk. So small changes can make a very big difference here on an otherwise decent diet, one that contains plenty of lean meats, fruits, vegetables, grains, etc. Now, this doesn't mean that we should never eat a sizable fatty steak, but it does unfortunately mean that it should be the exception rather than the norm. I would love to tell you that yes, we can eat sausages and bacon and brisket covered in eggs and slathered in butter and maybe some maple syrup as well. Actually, that's going to be pretty bad. Anyway, and that we could do that every day. But deep down, you know that that's not true. And you know that this is just these influencers whose livelihoods depend on their outspoken opinions being amplified by the algorithms, just talking shit, right? It's totally far away from common sense. It's not going to go away anytime soon, but just watch out, okay? Just be careful of who you follow and what they recommend. All right, I hope that was helpful. Forgive my rant, forgive my ramble, and I'll catch you soon.